So in chapter 15, we're going to be looking at the cardiovascular system. The heart is a very phenomenal organ in our body. The heart pumps 7,000 liters of blood every day and contracts about 2.5 billion times in your life. The cardiovascular system is made up of course, the heart, blood vessels, arterioles, capillaries, all of these things, veins, all of these things come together to form the cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system is broken down into two circuits, all right? So we have the pulmonary circuit, and then we have the systemic circuit. The pulmonary circuit, which is shown in blue here, sends oxygen-poor blood, deoxygenated blood, to the lungs to pick up oxygen, and then it drops off carbon dioxide so that we can expel it from the body in the lungs. The systemic circuit is going to send oxygen-rich blood or oxygenated blood and nutrients throughout the body to the body cells, and it can also help remove waste. And so here in this diagram you can see the path of the two circuits here, and we are going to learn the path of blood flow through the heart. And so you want to keep in mind the color coding here. This is going to really help you learn which sections are oxygenated and which sections are deoxygenated. This is what we call a closed system, and so there are no dead ends here. It's all joined and interconnected together, all right? And so I highly recommend that you draw these out and use the red and blue color coding. I'm going to give you a link or make a video of how to diagram this out. This is usually an essay in our class, but this is very, very important to know the path of blood flow through the heart. And it's much easier to learn this if you will draw out the heart, label the parts, and put them through instead of just trying to memorize the words in order, because that doesn't make any sense. That's not really learning. But if you will draw this out and learn how to do it, it's going to be something you can visualize and see, and you'll label them, and you'll have your color coding, which will help you to understand things better. You should know probably by now I'm very big on color coding because it helps take care of your neurobiology. It helps you to take advantage of, is what I mean to say. So let's go over the basic structure of the heart. The heart is not quite what we think of as our drawn Valentine type heart, but it does have that vague shape to it. It is hollow. It means it has some chambers that have some openings in there, kind of cone-shaped here, and it is a muscular pump. We have 4 chambers. We have 2 atrium, and you can see those here. So let's see. We've got the right atrium, and remember, you always want to be looking at this from your patient's perspective. So one thing I do when I am diagramming the blood flow of the heart and drawing out the heart, to make sure I don't accidentally do something just without thinking, is I write an R here for right, because that's my patient's right, and a left here for left. So that way you don't lose points or mix them up, and you get in the habit of always thinking of swapping them for your patients. Okay, so there is the right atrium here and the left atrium here, and then we also have ventricles, and these are larger. So here's the left ventricle and the right ventricle. And so the atria store blood, and the ventricles are a low pressure pump and a high pressure pump. So they really are what helps to push the blood out through the body and get it to where it needs to go. Alright, so the heart does vary with body size. The larger the body, obviously, the larger pump you're going to need, so the larger the heart is going to be. The heart lies, of course, in your thoracic cavity. The average size of a heart is 14 centimeters long and about 9 centimeters wide. Alright, so the heart is, of course, posterior to the sternum. It is medial to the lungs, anterior to the vertebral column. The base of the heart lies beneath the second rib, and the apex of the heart lies at the 5th intercostal rib. So while we think of the base being the bottom, that is going to be the base near the second rib. So it is going to be up here. Well, let's see. This way, and the apex is the more pointed in, which is going to be there, and it is seated just above the diaphragm. So why is that important? Why do we need to know that? Well, one very obvious reason is because we can sense or listen to an apical heartbeat by feeling or listening to the chest wall between the fifth and the sixth rib, 7.5 centimeters approximately to the left of the midline. And so that is very important to understand. We also can listen in different areas to hear different valves and vessels. Alright, so the heart is covered by a sac, basically, and we call this the pericardium or the pericardial sac. And this encloses the heart, and we break this down into three specific sections. The first one is going to be, well, I say the first one. Well, we have the fibrous pericardium, which is a loose-fitting outer sac, so it's the outermost sac around the heart, and it's made of dense connective tissue. One way you can keep this straight is to think fibrous first, okay? Fibrous, go. My pen is not working, comes first. I may have to work on this pen here. Anyway, so fibrous first. The visceral pericardium can also be called the epicardium. Visceral and epicardium, and this is going to be the innermost cardium, the nearest the viscera. Remember, visceral is always deep within. Epi means above, so it is just above the actual tissue of the heart. So that is the visceral or the deepest layer. And then the parietal pericardium is in the middle layer. So we have the pericardial cavity, which is going to contain the serous fluid that is going to be secreted by pericardial membranes, and the function of that is, of course, to reduce friction. Alright, so you can see here these layers and some of their alternative names here. We have the pericardium here. So here's pericardium. Pericardium there. You can see the outer fibrous pericardium, and you can kind of tell why it has the alternative name fibrous. It does look very fibrous, all right? And then serous pericardium, which we call the parietal area, so this is parietal. And then the visceral layer here on the inside, innermost layer here. We also have in the actual tissue of the heart what we call the myocardium. Myo means muscle, so the myocardium. And then we have the endocardium. Endo means inside. So this is the actual inside, inner lining, covering of things like the trabeculae, which we will get into as we study the heart. But this is a really nice diagram. And so I would study this one, perhaps draw this out and label it. Just another good visual here. You can see the three layers here. We have the outer epicardium, epi meaning above, myo middle cardium, and endocardium as well. Epicardium is going to protect the heart by reducing friction. It is made of a serous membrane, connective tissue, and some epithelium. Myocardium, okay, so now we're actually looking at the heart, not the sac covering, so be sure we're clear there. Myocardium is thick and made of the actual cardiac muscle, and then the endocardium is going to be on the inside. This is also made up of epithelium and connective tissue, and where we have what we call the Purkinje fibers. Purkinje fibers, and these actually bring the cardiac action potentials to the heart cells simultaneously, virtually, stimulating the contraction, which is very important that it does occur together. So this is a good breakdown of the three layers of the heart tissue. All right, so be sure to keep those straight. We have the three layers of the covering of the heart, the sac that the heart is in, basically. And then these are the three layers of the tissue of the actual heart itself. All right, so don't mix these two up, but be sure you do know these, and be sure that you know these and you know how to recognize these. All right, so the heart is divided into 4 chambers. So we're going to look at each of those and what comes through those. We've got the 2 upper atrium, or atria, if we're talking singular, and 4 lower ventricles. Sorry about that. And so let's remember, I told you to label your patients right and left, and so that's always going to be opposite. So over here is the right, and over here is the left. And this is a rough sketch of what we call the 60-second heart, which is something I will provide a link for, which is very, very helpful for you to practice and learn how to do. So when you're taking future exams, like a nursing entrance exam, you can draw the heart out very, very quickly and label it, and then be able to look at where the blood flow is coming and going from, rather than just trying to rote memorize and write down a list. It helps you to really understand it. It's really a very useful thing to learn. Okay. All right, and so let's go ahead and label these. Remember, the atrium are the upper chambers here. So we have the right atrium. Remember, that is the patient's right, and we have the left atrium. All right. And so from the right atrium below it, we will have the right ventricle and the left ventricle. One way to keep this straight is A goes over V, and so A is always on top, right? A is first in the alphabet, A always comes on top, all right? So the right atrium is going to receive deoxygenated blood, and I really, really, really want you to use this color coding, okay? It really, really helps. Oh, I forgot to draw your little lower inferior vena cava, inferior meaning below. So from the inferior vena cava, it is going to receive blood, and that's going to come in through here. And this is the superior vena cava. And so later on, I'll get a white screen and I'll draw this whole thing out for you and diagram the whole thing out. Okay, I'll do that in a separate video, I think, because it'll just be a white screen. That is typically what I use for an essay for this unit, because it is so important for you to learn this. All right, so it comes from the inferior and superior vena cava and the coronary sinus. I don't have the coronary sinus on here. That is part of what feeds the actual heart itself, and so we'll look at that in lab. All right, and then so the right ventricle is going to receive blood from the right atrium, and so it is going to come through here. Okay, and these are valves. I'm not going to worry about naming those valves for you yet, but the blood is going to come up and go on out through to the body. All right, and we'll add to this later on. All right, and so the left atrium then is going to receive oxygenated blood. It's going to come through these pulmonary veins to the left atrium, which is then going to go down through to the left ventricle, and it's also going to go out through some valves, and it's going to go on out through excuse me, to the body. All right, and so this is also an interest. There's 4 pulmonary veins here. This one's going to be blue coming out. All right, and so if you color code these, you can see oxygenated and deoxygenated. It's going to be very much it's going to be much more easy for you to memorize and learn this, and not just rote memorize. All right, because we're going to go through and label all of these parts, and I want you to be able to do that from memory. So even if this is online, you really need to practice that, because I'm telling you, you're going to see this again. This is very helpful. All right, so the upper and the upper chambers, let me start there, have very thin walls and receive blood returning to the heart, so that's why it's deoxygenated. Okay, these are separated by the inter meaning between, atrial, because it's between the atriums, septum. Okay, we also have the interventricular septum, which I kind of drew a little too wide here. All right, but that's between the ventricles. All right, so if you understand what these root words mean, it helps you to understand anatomy and not just do memorization. All right, so the lower right and left ventricles are then forcing blood out of the heart into the arteries and veins. All right, so the right and left atrium are separated by that interventricular septum. All right, so we have 2 what we call sulci, separating the divisions between the chambers and carry the major blood vessels. Sulci, think sunken in, and these are highlighted in red here. We have the atrioventricular sulcus here, that is encircling the heart between the atria and the ventricles, and then we have the interventricular sulcus located on the septum, separating the right and left ventricles. So I tried to leave our APR images for APR, but sometimes they're just really good, and so I use them here in lecture as well. So here you can see some of the heart valves, and they do have different names, and you need to be familiar with the different names. So the first one is the pulmonary, and it is what we call a semilunar valve, semilunar. We call them semi-lunar because they kind of have a half moon shape, and I try to draw that in the diagram. All right. Then we have the tricuspid or right atrioventricular, all right, tricuspid. Next we have the bicuspid. So tri has three sections. It has three flaps basically, and bi has two. So we have the bicuspid, which is also called the mitral valve, and is also called the left atrioventricular valve because it's between the atrium and the ventricles. All right. So I usually say bicuspid or mitral, but you need to be familiar with atrioventricular as well because that is commonly used. And so you need to kind of be familiar with all those names. So if you see it with a different name, you'll still know what we're talking about, okay? The pulmonary valve, or the pulmonary semilunar valve, has three cusps. A cusp is a round or a pointed projection. That is not the right pin. You can see two of them here. The other one is kind of out of sight, but those are the cusp. So there's three of these in a tricuspid and two in a bi. All right, and so this opens when the right ventricle contracts. When relaxed, blood will back up into the pulmonary trunk, and that would cause that would close the pulmonary valve, which prevents backflow, which is very important. We want one-way travel through the heart. All right, so the right atrium is going to receive deoxygenated blood. So here you see blue color from two veins, the superior vena cava, which is seen here, and the inferior vena cava. You can only see it a little bit in blue there. It would extend off there. The coronary sinus also drains venous blood into the right atrium. All right, so the tricuspid valve, also known as the right atrioventricular valve, regulates the blood going from the right atrium to the right ventricle and prevents backward flow. So here we're looking at the bicuspid or mitral valve. We have pulmonary veins. You can see those in the diagram over here on the right. You have your pulmonary veins that bring the blood from the lungs to the left atrium. So they're coming in here to the left atrium from the right and left lungs. We have four of those. There's two on each side. So here's the other ones over here. The blood passes from the left atrium to the left ventricle here, and then it's going to go back up through, you can see the arrow here, through the mitral or bicuspid, also known as atrioventricular valve. And that valve is going to prevent backwards flow, and then blood is going to exit here through the aorta. The aortic valve or aortic semilunar valve is at the base of the aorta. The mitral and tricuspid, also called atrioventricular valves, because they are between the atria and ventricles. The pulmonary and aortic are also called semilunar, of course, because their cusp have those half moon shapes to them. This table in your textbook is a good summary here of the valves and their location and their function, so I'd be sure to study this one. Alright, so we have a picture here at the top left that shows you chordae tendineae here that attach the cusp of the tricuspid valve to the papillary muscles on the right ventricles, and they basically hold them in place. So they're fibrous. Chordae tendineae here. The fibrous rings, which other masses of dense connective tissue come together in a portion of the septum between the ventricles, which we call the interventricular septum, is what makes up what we call the skeleton of the heart. And so that is what we are seeing here in the bottom picture. We call it the skeleton of the heart. Alright, so this is a diagram of the heart. I will send a link for you to look at how to draw the 60-second heart, and I would highly recommend that you practice that first, and then you can come in and learn how to label things. And then after you label them, you can come through with your red and blue markers and lay out the path of the blood flow through the heart. And this is really, really valuable and worth your time. All right, so we know that atrium start on the top, so we're going to start by labeling. We want to label this is our patient's right and our patient's left, and so this is going to be the right atrium, and then we have the right ventricle, then we'll have the left ventricle, and then the right ventricle here on top. All right, so looking at some other parts in order here, we have the superior vena cava, and then below that, I haven't drawn it, but here is the inferior vena cava. All right, and so then we have the tricuspid valve. So this is the tricuspid valve. All right, and then next we have the pulmonary artery, which is right here. This is the pulmonary artery. We have the pulmonary veins, and these are a set of 4. So right there and right here, these are pulmonary veins. That is important to notice the difference between artery and vein here. So pulmonary veins. Let's see. Then we have the bicuspid valve, and I want you to notice, I think I skipped this one. Well, tricuspid valve is here, so I tried to kind of draw your 3 cusp there. This is your bicuspid valve. So after that, we have the pulmonary valve. Well, the pulmonary valve goes to the pulmonary artery, so this is the pulmonary valve. Here is the aorta, or the aortic arch, if you want to see the arch there. Then we have the, let's see, we've got the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve here, okay? And so that's our 4 valves. This is the apex of the heart here. The base of the heart will be more near the top. We are going to the lungs here, to the lungs, on this side, and from the lungs entering on this side. So we're going to start with the deoxygenated blood. That is going to come through from the superior vena cava. Let's go with a little bit lighter blue, and the inferior vena cava. It is then going to go through the right, into the right atrium, and so once it's into the right atrium, it will flow through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. It will go from the right ventricle to the pulmonary valve, through the pulmonary valve to the pulmonary arteries. All right, so this is deoxygenated blood, and that will go on out to the lungs. So now let's look at the oxygenated side. It will go on out to the lungs, where at the lungs it will go and pick up oxygen, and then it is going to come in through these pulmonary veins into the right atrium, and I have a V there. Let's correct that and turn that into an A. That should say right atrium. So it's going to go into the right atrium, and then it's going to go through the bicuspid or mitral valve into the left ventricle, and then it's going to go through the aortic valve into the aorta. So this line should really be coming over here into the aorta, and it's going to go out from the aorta on out into the rest of the body. Okay, and so that's a rough diagram sketch. I'll try to put a nice clean picture of this online for you, where you can access that if you would like, or I can email it to you so you can have a really clean picture. And I might actually still make another good video of this using a board as well, but I wanted to make sure you had it. All right, so let's go over this again. We're going to start from the systemic circuit. We are deoxygenated. We are coming in through the, let's see what's going to be a good color here. We'll go with purple. No, we'll stick with blue. We're going in from the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava, also the coronary sinus as well. Then we're going to go to the right atrium. We're going to go through the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle, and then we're going to go on out through the pulmonary valve here. into the pulmonary trunk. Then we're going to go on out the pulmonary arteries here onto the lung. So we're going to go to each lung, all right, and we're going to pick up some oxygen at the alveolar capillaries, and then we're going to come back oxygenated. And once we are oxygenated, we're going to come through the pulmonary veins here. We have 4 of those, 2 on each side, pulmonary veins into the left atrium, and then we're going to go through the mitral or bicuspid valve into the left ventricle, and then we're going to go on up through the aortic valve into the aortic trunk and the aortic arch on out through to the body, and that is going to the systemic circuit from there. All right. All right, so the blood supply to the heart. The aorta branches to the right and left coronary artery, and these are going to be superior to the aortic valve. So the left and right coronary arteries are what supply blood to the tissues of the heart itself. All right, so these supply the heart itself. All right, so the heart has to function together in a coordinated manner. The valves, or the atrium and ventricles, can't just contract whenever they want to, all right? So the atria contract, and we call that systole, atrial systole. So systole, think squeezing. And the ventricles are then going to relax. That is ventricular diastole, so they are relaxing. The ventricles are going to contract, and then the atria will relax. So both do relax for a brief period of time, and this forms our complete heartbeat or the cardiac cycle. Blood pressure in the large systemic arteries is going to be the greatest during that ventricular systole. So how do our heart sounds coordinate with the events going on? The classic lump-dum of the heart is due to vibrations in the heart from that blood flow occurring with that relaxation and contraction and the closing of those valves. The first is the lub, which occurs during ventricular systole, and the atrioventricular valve closes. The second is the dub, occurring with the ventricular diastole as the pulmonary aortic valve closes. Heart sounds can tell us lots of things. They can tell us if we have an issue with heart valves. Things like endocarditis, which is inflammation of the endocardium, can cause an erosion of the valve cusp and allow blood leakage, which can create what we call a murmur, which is an abnormal heart sound. Murmurs can be harmless. Me, for instance, I was born with a murmur. They thought I outgrew it, but I still have a rare extra heartbeat about once every 24 hours, but it's completely harmless. Or they can be really severe, requiring surgery. So it really just depends. So here we are looking at the regions of the thoracic area where your heart sound for each heart valve can be heard. The aortic sound from the patient's right and the pulmonic sound is found on the patient's left. The mitral valve can be heard from the 5th intercostal space just at the nipple line on the left. The tricuspid valve can be heard down here where we at the 5th space to the right of the sternum. All right, and so these are the 4 areas where you can hear those valves. Cardiac muscle fibers are pretty special. They are the only fibers that can self-ignite, so to speak. They don't need an action potential coming from outside of the system in order for the heart to contract. When they contract, these muscle fibers form what we call a functional syncytium. All right, this is very important because this allows a very rapid, coordinated contraction of muscles as a single unit. All right, and they do this through what we call the intercalated disc and synaptic transmission because of those intercalated discs. You may remember those from Anatomy and Physiology 1, and you can actually see one of those right here. It's a little hard to see in that picture, but there's one there. They look kind of like a little jagged line that looks like that's probably one right there. So the functional syncytium is a mass of cells that function together as a unit, all right? And we can divide this into 2 areas. In the atrial walls, we can call this the atrial syncytium, and in the ventricular walls, of course, the ventricular syncytium.